In the world of Subnautica, there exist some species and creatures which are absolutely gargantuan, towering over the player as they emerge from the darkness below. However, what if I told you that in the past, there used to be creatures not only much larger, but also presumably much more dangerous than anything that can currently be found in the world of Subnautica. Fortunately today, only their bones remain, and that will be the main topic of this video. I will be taking a look at the 3 skeletons which can be found in the Lost River in the order of their age, starting from the youngest. I will tell you everything we know about these remnants, what kind of creature they probably originated from, what that creature could have looked like in life, and any other interesting points of trivia that I'm able to dig up. So without any further ado, jump into your sea moth, get your archaeological tools ready, and let's go. Now starting us off, let's travel 1000 years in the past and look at research specimen Theta. The bones of this large predator can be found in the main aquarium of the disease research facility, where it was presumably kept for a very long time for testing purposes. From the databank entry, we learned that its habitat once supported extensive plant life, which has obviously since then decayed, and that when the facility collapsed, this specimen was most likely either left to die or killed right on the spot. We also get the information that some of the skeletal traits are shared with the biter and sand sharks, specifically the distinct double eye sockets, and parts of its armor plating on the skeleton. However, whatever evolutions have happened since then have probably diverged long ago. Now looking at the skeleton, perhaps the most interesting feature are the forearms, as they are very unique and different from anything else that can be seen in the world of Subnautica. While you might initially think that because of these forearms, this is somehow farly related to the Sea Emperor or perhaps the Sea Dragon, there are some major structural differences, specifically how the humerus's equivalent is made from 2 fused bones of approximately equal size that run parallel to each other, as well as having 5 fingers, if you will, on its hands rather than the Sea Dragon's 4. You might also think that these arms were originally just fins. However, in the PDA it does state that these indeed had webbed hands on the end rather than fins. Looking at the aforementioned 2 eye sockets, the secondary pairs of eyes appear to be considerably smaller and much less developed than those found on the presumably closest species of sand shark or the biter, in which the secondary pair of eyes is almost equal to the primary one. It should also be noted that the bone shark, which could also be a relative, lacks any indication of prior existing eye sockets, so if it belongs somewhere in the evolutionary tree, it must have diverged much earlier than the sand shark. Finally, this skeleton contains an external shell, which is commonplace amongst the group, both with the sand shark and bone sharks, which would presumably make this species much heavier and, in terms of survivability, have them prefer their defensive capabilities over outmaneuvering their opponents. But if this creature seems terrifying to you, it is nothing compared to what's about to come, as we travel much further in time to 1 million years ago, where we find an ancient skeleton belonging to a presumably extinct Leviathan-class organism, which now rests right outside of the Lost River laboratory cache, surrounded by all kinds of precursor technology. The databank doesn't tell us much, but from what we can gather, projections suggest that this life form would have been larger than any other living specimen encountered on the planet right now. Looking at the bones themselves, the skeleton appears to be composed of many bone plates and 12 large holes which run parallel down either side of the body, 6 eye sockets dotting the head, and many sharp teeth, each of which is larger than the player model themselves. It should be noted here that it is very difficult to imagine what this species looked like alive, considering we don't know how much of the skeleton is currently visible to us, or whether any other remnants of it simply got swayed away by forming of new land or by sea currents. It is also worth mentioning here that many players have gone to assume that this is only the head part of the animal, considering the fact that it was once named Ancient Skull. However, in a livestream with the narrative designer Tom Joubert, this was pointed out and corrected, considering the fact that it also contains a spine and ribs, clearly classifying it as more than just a skull. Now, looking at the skeleton a bit more closely, considering the thickness of the bones, it makes it rather unlikely that this creature would be able to swim at all, most likely rather remaining on the seabed and moving alongside it, which could potentially explain the lateral openings at its body as being the place where limbs would be attached, allowing this creature to crawl along the seabed rather than have to swim. Now, looking at its armored exterior, you might make the assumption that it would belong into the same category as the previously mentioned specimen Theta or the bone shark, sand shark, and etc. However, this seems kind of unlikely as the armored plates here are joined directly into the spine and into the ribs rather than being a separate structure as in the previously mentioned specimens, resembling more of a turtle or a tortoise in their form. In its facial region, it does possess the mentioned 6 eye sockets, which is a feature not currently shared by any living organism on the planet besides the upcoming contender. However, as seen in the previous development from the Theta skeleton, it is possible that whatever living relatives exist right now have simply developed to the point where this feature would be lost. Now, a bit of speculation regarding their movement could be that these things originally lived in the ground as opposed to simply living out in the open, using their many appendages to burrow into the rocks and mud below, which could also explain why this is the only known fossil, as the others could theoretically be buried down in the rocks below, or even theoretically still alive, but luckily never breaching to the surface. And yet, despite this ginormous, carnivorous, millipede type organism, we can still go further in the past and encounter something much more dangerous. Traveling all the way to approximately 3 million years ago into the area of the bone fields, and we can find the appropriately named gargantuan fossil. A skeleton that belonged to an eel-like Leviathan class super predator, which would absolutely dwarf both the Sea Dragon and the Sea Emperor Leviathan in their current size. From the databank entry, we can learn that the sheer size of this animal would have prohibited it from entering such an enclosed space as the Lost River where it can be found, suggesting that the geography of the planet has majorly shifted and moved around since the time of its death. It is also worth noting that despite its colossal size, what is currently visible to us is only approximately 1/3 of the skeleton, which, if multiplied by 3, gives us the absolute approximate size of this gargantuan predator, anywhere between 1,100 and 1,300 meters long, putting it well over half the length of the entire playable area of Subnautica, and clearly demonstrating why a species like this could not survive in the area where the bones are now found. Now, because of how old these bones are, it is very difficult to determine what led to its death and its final resting location in the Lost River, considering the fact that its bones were most likely moved from its final resting location by a combination of landslides and volcanic activity which has occurred since then. If we were to guess what this species was like in life, because of its sheer size, it would most definitely have to live in the areas of the crater edge, most likely feeding on large planktivorous life forms such as the ghost leviathans or the sea emperors, as well as any other species which may have been alive at that point of time. We can also assume that because of their predatory nature, they would have had very long life cycles and only mate rarely, as any larger increase in the number of these species would most likely lead to great imbalance in the ecosystem, simply based on the amount of food they would need to consume to sustain their lifestyle. Looking at the skeleton closer, we can see that the gargantuan head shares some similarities with the before mentioned ancient skeleton, most specifically the 3 eye sockets and a multitude of sharp teeth. However, as previously mentioned, it is very unlikely that these 2 species were related in any way, and if they were, their evolutionary tree must have split very long ago. You could also make the assumption that this creature is very distantly related to something like the Sea Dragon Leviathan, However, these similarities might only be very superficial, as large parts of the skeleton are missing and we cannot make that assumption based on what is currently present. It is also worth noting that two more skeletons seemingly belonging to the same species, just in a much younger state, can be found in the Lost River, possibly giving us an idea of what different life cycles and life stages of this creature look like, and even the possibilities that young juveniles might in fact live in much more shallow and safe areas before migrating out into the crater edge later upon reaching adulthood. But on the same page, you could also theorize that the large specimen that we see might not even be the final growth stages of this species, and that in fact, theoretically, they might seemingly grow even larger out there in the void, and the only reason why we can't see their bones is because they're lying in depths which we simply cannot reach. So in the end, I suppose if you ever venture into the territory of the sea dragon or the ghost leviathan, you encounter that species, you get jump scared and then cry yourself to sleep, well, you can always at least rest assured that if any of these creatures on this list today still existed, that jump scare would have probably been much worse. But anyways, with that, I'm going to conclude this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it interesting, maybe even learning something new along the way. If you have any facts that you think I forgot, or any theories that you would like to go into, please make sure to leave them down in the comment section below, as people who are already curious on this topic would most likely like to read them as well. If you enjoyed the video itself, maybe consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. All of those would be very much appreciated. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.